Oh, we're gonna walk around a lot anyway.
Yeah. So you're just gonna do that? That's fine.
I mean, you're pretty good.
All right, guys. Our next talk is going to be from Rockie Brockway and Yocum on Att&ck effectiveness.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. I'm Rocky. I'm the practice lead for the office of the CSO at Att&ck. And I mean, at a high level, you can take a look at my cute little LinkedIn profile or whatever. But I've been doing information security, risk, penetration testing, etc. for 26 years. I make a lot of things with wood and whatnot. So, and then Rick.
Hey, I'm Rick Yocum. I've been doing security compliance stuff for about 16 years, about 6 of those in consulting, about 10 of them running security or compliance programs for public and private companies. Worked in practically every industry, all shapes and sizes, and now I'm lucky enough to work for Att&ck.
Wow. And at any point, if either of us start to trail,
Oh yeah.
let us know.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Kind of a high level agenda here. All right. We're gonna who's familiar with the Att&ck framework today? Just a couple people. Two people or more. A couple. All right. We're going to talk about basically how we have put together a framework, an assessment framework, using the Att&ck framework itself. We'll talk about what is the Att&ck framework really briefly. At the end of the day, like this illustration here, the top row, that represents tactics, right? And the way we're using the framework is basically, and again, at a high level, this component of the Att&ck framework is documenting all of the known attacker techniques that are out there today, right? The known attacker techniques. And they're broken down into individual, tactic groupings, right? So initial access, execution, persistence, etc. So that's one component of the framework that we're using today. We're going to kind of, give some credit where credit is due from an inception perspective, and then we're going to talk about, the evolution of, what we really started with to where we got today, coverage, what coverage actually means, and then what effectiveness actually means, because they're two very, very different things. Rick's going to talk about some sample inputs and sample outputs of our model. We're going to then discuss some of the considerations that we went through over a number of glasses of wine when we were really kind of building a lot of this stuff together. And situationally, that was actually for a client that was just like, we want more. And we're just like, we can probably do more. And then reporting considerations, and then where we think we're taking this next. Okay, so strap in. Okay. For those of you who don't know, MITRE is a not-for-profit organization, came out of MIT. They run they edit and certify all the CVE entries. They manage federal R&D centers, and the Att&ck framework they developed in 2013, the initial kind of concept. So what it is a free web-based referential index of techniques used by adversaries. And all those techniques then are mapped to tactics and data sources and platforms. Now, data sources is going to be really one of the key elements here from how we're using the framework for this kind of assessment, our assessment framework. There are also additional components of the Att&ck framework, which include mappings of known threat actor groups, what industries they are actually targeting, and what techniques each of those groups have been known to actually execute in the wild, right? So that also gives us a whole other kind of really interesting set of data that we can play with from an adversary perspective. And if anybody, again, doesn't know what it is, just take a look at the actual link there. Anybody can use this. This is an open source framework, the Att&ck framework. You can use it to understand gaps in your current control sets, right, in relation to known attacker techniques. You can also use it to illustrate redundancies in controls, right? So, as an example, we did one of these assessments for a client of ours, and due to the size of that company, there were like 3 different business units that actually all invested in different DLP systems, and we then really clearly illustrated that there is a significant amount of redundancy in terms of your control sets just by walking through the Att&ck framework and mapping all those tools to those techniques. You can better understand the likelihood of a technique to be addressed by tools and processes, right? How changes to people, process, technologies will impact effectiveness, and we'll get into what are we defining as coverage and what are we defining as effectiveness, because effectiveness is really people, right? And that's something that just the MITRE ATT&ck framework on its own isn't taking a look at, right? And then the most efficient ways to improve adversarial defenses. Okay, so the inception here. In 2017, the Att&ck framework added profiles, like I said, to the actual mapping threat actor groups. And that's what kind of triggered my interest in the Att&ck framework itself, because we do risk assessments, and when we do full-blown risk assessments, we're taking a look at really a 4-phase risk assessment approach. The first phase is working with leadership to understand what the critical business systems are within the organization and understand loss thresholds, right? So at what financial impact, let's say the severe financial impact, what number would that be to your organization based on your annual revenue and business model that would put you out of business? Now let's work backwards from there and kind of just, what's a significant financial loss, what's a low financial loss, etc. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is adversary analysis, right? What are the motivated threat actors out there that are motivated enough to try to take your stuff, right? And so that's when I started looking at this from the threat actor, the documented threat actor, because now this is a resource. It's not the only resource, but it's a resource where I can say, okay, I'm working with an organization. They're in, let's say, the oil extraction industry. So how many documented threat actor groups have been known to date to be targeting the oil extraction industry? Now, what are the techniques that they've been seen to actually use in the wild? Now let's make sure phase 3 of our risk assessment, which is penetration testing, is targeting those business critical systems that we defined, with leadership, using those active techniques by those threat actor groups. And then we can begin to look at likelihood and impact as phase 4 of our risk assessment. So that's where I kind of got drawn into this attack framework. That same year, Roberto Rodriguez started published a pair of articles on threat hunting. This is really kind of the light bulb moment, because what he did was basically he wrote an API in PowerShell that can connect into the Att&ck wiki and just download the entire thing into like an Excel spreadsheet, right? So then he took a look at, and I think it's the next slide, but basically what he did was he used VLOOKUPs in Excel to map data sources that are associated with the individual techniques documented in the framework. And in doing so, then created a way from a threat hunting perspective where he could kind of like test teams to see how well they're hunting their threats. Well, that's really awesome, and we took that idea and applied it to this framework that we're gonna kind of go through. Right? So this is a sample technique in the attack framework itself, right? In this particular instance, it's DLL sideloading. One of the cool things, obviously there's a description of them now, but one of the really cool things here is data sources. Now, basically what that is if your current controls are looking at those 3 data sources, process use of network, process monitoring, and loaded DLLs, then your current controls should be able to detect DLL cycle. Make sense? So that's really where this kind of started to fall into place for us. Now we can basically work with an organization and say, okay, let's inventory all of your controls. For each control, let's figure out which of and within the attack framework, I think there are 50-something data sources, right? So, the loaded DLLs, process network, process monitoring, there's 50-some of those. And map those data sources to your actual tools. Let's say it's a Palo Alto firewall or a CrowdStrike EDR or whatever, right? And that should then give us an idea of how well your tool sets in a perfect world scenario should map against each of the 223 individual known attack techniques documented in the framework. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Cool. This is an example of that other side of the framework, which is the documented threat actor groups. So in this instance, Threat Group 3390, they have some aliases over there, blah, blah, blah. They've been around since 2010 and has targeted organizations in aerospace, government, defense, technology, energy, and manufacturing. Right? So that's really interesting data. We can use that. It also lists each of the known attack techniques that they've been seen to actually execute in the wild. Right? So we can use that too when we're talking about risk assessment. What else? Anything else here? Okay, so that's kind of cool, but again, it's really kind of perfect world. That's a perfect world snapshot, right? That's what we're calling coverage. And coverage assesses if the tool set has the capabilities to address each of those known documented techniques. And during these assessments, right, so here's a scenario. I'll just kind of give you the example. We were doing a coverage assessment for one of our clients, and they're pretty sophisticated. They're pretty advanced from an organizational security perspective. And we gave them kind of like, okay, here's how you look. We spent a week or so, a couple weeks, working with their teams to really kind of map out all of their tools, and they had just a ridiculous amount of controls and tools. And at the end of the day, when we showed them kind of like the map of just like an Excel heat map, right? Here's 223 attack techniques, and here's a heat map. They're just like, that's cute. That doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me how good we are, right? So that's when he and I went to the bar and started thinking about this a little more. So, you want to take it?
Yeah. So we had to build a thing, right? Perfect. So we had to build a thing to figure that out. So in our head, we know if we have all these tools indexed, and we index these tools against these data sources, and the MITRE framework has these data sources indexed to techniques, great, I can get a binary 1 to 0 as to whether or not you have the right tool for a technique. And you can see some cool stuff like that, like whether you need to buy more tools because you have gaps. But what they didn't know was, yeah, we have an EDR solution, but we don't know how well it's working. Well, that's a big difference. Whether or not your EDR solution is going to catch something is different than whether your EDR solution could catch something. And whether or not something will catch something is based on a bunch of environmental variables. Some of those variables are, is it deployed everywhere? If it's deployed everywhere, okay, higher likelihood it'll catch something. If it's not deployed everywhere, lower likelihood. What's the length of time from an event happening to an alert trigger? If that's a really long time frame, your likelihood of detecting something in the time frames you want is going to be low. How often are you updating? Right? All these variables. What's your staff doing? So we had to build something to assess these variables for each tool to figure out how, not only if you have a tool from a coverage perspective, but whether or not you're using that tool well whether from an effectiveness perspective. So the terms we land on, obviously, are coverage versus effectiveness. And just to help illustrate, we have some of the differences between the two up here, right? So coverage is binary, it's 1 or 0. Do you have a tool to cover a technique or do you not? Effectiveness is qualitative. It's a 1 to 5. We tend to use CMMI scores, so we're currently going with 1 to 5 on this, but it's how good are you? Aggregators. So if you have a SEM, for instance, a place where all these logs are aggregated, should that play into coverage? Well, probably not, because an aggregator is not actually detecting on a data source, it's consolidating data sources, right? But should it play into effectiveness? Almost certainly, because it's definitely going to impact how well you're correlating data. It's definitely going to impact how quickly things are happening. And your training on a SEM, or a certain staff member's training on a SEM, could be very different than their training on the tools that are actually doing the detection, the firewalls, the EDRs, whatever. So aggregators don't impact results in coverage, they do effectiveness. Potential versus actual likelihood, we covered that a little bit already. So what do you need to do these? So for a coverage assessment, you need less data, right? You need a listing of the tools, you need to map it to data sources. For effectiveness, you need all those variables that we're talking about. And you need those variables for each tool that you're looking at. Coverage really focuses, it's a tool-based assessment, gaps and redundancies of tools. Effectiveness gets you a lot more strategically in terms of, do we need to staff up or staff down? Do we need to change our policies around how we're managing data throughout the environment, all that stuff. So some of these pictures, just for an example, this is what our tool spits out. You can see the 1s and 0s on the one side for specific techniques within Att&ck and 1 to 5 for another. They both address protective and detective tools, but we do that separately. We'll run an assessment for protective controls, an assessment for detective controls, because if you try to smush that into one assessment, you probably muddy the waters. Now at the end, we like to smush the reports together so you can see where there's true gaps, where there's nothing protecting or detecting against. But from a tools assessment perspective, we run this separately.
This is also really, really tactical. Right?
Yeah.
This is not like a report that you're going to show the leadership. You'll see kind of like at the end, it's a big colored map of really technical stuff.
Right.
You can figure out how to communicate that to the leadership, but if they're not this, how would that happen?
Right. So what goes into this? So this is kind of like what our tool looks like from an Excel perspective. You got your systems down the far left side. You got whether it's the top, whether it's a detective or protective tool. You got the platforms. The stuff in yellow specifically is the stuff you need for coverage assessment. So at the bottom, there's then tool mappings on a separate tab to all these individual data sources, and obviously this list goes way down over that way, even just for the 50 data sources. But then you get, for an effectiveness assessment, you can see the stuff that includes the additional stuff that you're going to want to collect. Things like what's the scope of implementation, how frequently you're updating, what's the overall availability, all that good stuff. And then, if there's an aggregator aggregating those logs, you're going to want to score those tools as well from an effectiveness perspective, because if you have firewalls that are covering 100% of your organization, but only 20% of those firewalls are going to your SEM, and you're looking for your SEM for all your alerts, okay, well now you have an issue. So you plug all that stuff in, and really the meat of the assessment is, from our perspective, talking to the subject matter experts and saying, what tools do you have, and how are you actually using them, right? Different organizations will use the same tools in wildly different ways sometimes. So the same tool, even though it can do 10 data sources, 20 data sources, every data source, I don't know if it is every data source, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it to see all those data sources. They might have it implemented in a different capacity. So you have to run that analysis for every organization a little separately. We come in knowing, by and large, what a tool can do, usually, but what they're actually doing with the tool is the stuff that you might be talking about. So that calculator spits out this kind of stuff. This is a heat map that Rockie was talking about. A portion of a heat map, because again, it's big and tall and wide. But specifically, you can see it spits out a bunch of these heat maps. So this is detective effectiveness for Linux, which is different than protective effectiveness for Linux, and it's different than protective effectiveness for Windows. So ultimately, you spit out a bunch of graphs across platforms, across protection and detection, and you smush protection and detection together. And you can see this a whole bunch of different ways as you're kind of analyzing the results. We also spit out a bunch of metrics, just numerical metrics for the executives that are like, hey, just give me a number. Are we failing? Are we great? Give me one number to tell me if I'm secure, which the people in this room probably know isn't really a thing, but you can start to approximate some stuff, some bits at a high level anyway to understand, well, if we want to be at least a 3, our effectiveness from 1 to 5 scale, we want to be at least a 3, and at the very top, you see initial access is 8 out of 10. So maybe 8 of your 10 tactics, or 10 techniques in initial access are 3 or above. Great. We're 80% of where we want to be. You can start to get to a point where, at least at a really high level, you can talk about how far the gap is from where you are to where you need to be and start to have those conversations. It doesn't tell you what you need to do so much, is how much distance you need to cover.
And if you go back real quick, one of the other things that we are actually working on is putting together a database of all of these different tools and what data sources are mapped into those tools, right? Because right now it's a manual process. We have to actually, if we don't know inherently what that particular tool is and can kind of go across all the data sources, we have to actually do some research and kind of figure out and maybe talk to the vendors or whatever, right? But we're, as we are doing more of these, we're actually building that database out so that a lot of this stuff then gets easier and easier over time.
And Miter's helping us out with that because they're publishing tool assessments themselves. Now, the way they're doing it is against specific threat groups. So if threat group A only uses 50 of the 230 techniques, then when they partner with Palo Alto or whatever, say, okay, how many of these would you catch? They do it in that context of that threat group. So we don't necessarily know across all 230, we know across the 50 of threat groups. They're slowly building it out, but it's starting to come where that's going to be just up on the wiki and you can find it yourself.
I'm just impatient.
Yes?
So, in the spirit of there are no stupid questions, as a security practitioner, one of the things I've struggled with MITRE with MITRE Att&ck is that I work with a lot of mid and small size organizations, and this seems like the gauging and computer system for the space shuttle, when most of the people that I'm working with are driving a 1979 Buick, and we just need to make sure it gets from point A to point B. They don't even realize that the seatbelt, they're going to die with the seatbelts they have, and they've got maybe firewalls that are out of date. So my question is or will there ever be an application for MITRE Att&ck to smaller organizations that, as we know, are the feeders to a lot of their subcontractors,
Sure.
to a lot of these very large organizations?
That's a really good question. I'll preface my answer with, you're totally right. Like, this is really kind of for more mature organizations, right? For smaller organizations, coverage is probably where you want to start, right? If you're working with small to mid-sized organizations and they don't really do pen testing or whatever, right? We already kind of like gauge that, let's say low maturity level. So yeah, I mean, baby steps. Coverage is probably where you want to, coverage, right? Because,
I already know everything they have is not effective.
right. If they don't even have a security
I don't
team,
need that.
right? If it's an IT guy that also does security,
Right.
don't even bother, right? Realistically, because we're talking with security teams,
Yes.
to get all this data, extrapolate all this data about, do you have enough people looking at your stuff?
But as a practitioner on the coverage part, I can get some value out of this work that's being done. So I think it's
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally.
And the thing that I would add to Rocky's answer is, so the way we approach this, particularly with small and medium-sized organizations, and the way we kind of set the spreadsheet up the way that we have, and it was an aha moment for us, is don't talk to small IT shops about DLL sideloading. They're not, chances are that's not their day job. They're not going to understand that. Talk to them about the tools they have, because they're going to understand the tools they're in place. And you, as a security practitioner, make that translation between, oh, you have this tool? Okay, you can cover DLL sideloading with it, right? And you can use those data the data sources as a shortcut to quickly figure out what tools they have in place and how that maps and how that's going to cover to the 230 some techniques. All right. So what else are we doing with this? So this is something we just started. So we covered effectiveness stuff over here. Another question that tends to get asked a lot
By leadership
is, hey, I'm in the financial industry. What do I need to worry about? And we all know the answer is everything, right?
How am I doing against my peer CEOs or CEOs?
Right. Am I spending enough or too much? All these things, right? So we started saying, okay, let's pull the information as much as we can out of the threat or the threat actor group and industry stuff in MITRE because it is mapped to techniques. And let's look at it on an industry by industry basis to find the hotspots, right? If you're in the financial vertical, what are the threat actor groups in MITRE? What do they tend to target? If you're in the extraction industry, what do they tend to target? Funnily enough, easy techniques are easy techniques, so there's a heck of a lot of overlap between the various industries, but it does allow us to ultimately sort of start to answer that question, and particularly for organizations that are like, oh my gosh, I have nothing, where should I start? Okay, well, everything's important, but maybe you start here because this is known to be used in the wild against organizations in your industry.
Yeah, well, actually, you're missing a huge part of it. He put this part of it together. This stuff is not actively tied together in a framework form that you can just pull out.
That's fair.
Right? So Rick actually took a lot of time, and remember the slide with the threat actor group description. This threat actor group is targeting manufacturing, extraction, right? That's all he had to work with. So he kind of built this whole database.
Yeah. So in the MITRE attack framework, the stuff around techniques and tactics and data sources pretty mature. They've been banging away at it for 5-6 years. It's in a pretty good place. The last update 6 months ago added 50 techniques, but it's pretty good. It's very consistent. The stuff on threat actor groups, the industries they work in, what techniques they use directly versus what techniques are associated with software that they may use. That's a lot harder to pull out in an automated fashion. In some cases, it's buried in there, but it's buried in free text fields and stuff like that. So you can pull this stuff out of MITRE. We have done it. It will take some legwork to do.
And actually, that brings up a funny haha story because we were in the middle of one of these assessments, and Att&ck, which was the first inaugural Att&ck conference, was back in October, and that's when they decided to update the entire framework and add 50 or 60 more attack techniques. So we were in the middle of an assessment, and I went to go update, and I was like, oh, wait a minute. We had to completely retool the calculator. It's like, oh, shit.
So, and then this is the detail behind each one of those prior things. So most utilized techniques for the extraction industry. You can see where credential dumping's a big one, scripting's a big one, stuff.
But I mean, something like this, right? If you're working with an organization and they don't know really where to start, okay, let's start with tools that have data, that are looking at data sources that are at least looking at these major things from your industry, right?
Or even at a higher level, say, okay, well, let's start with a tactic, right? Let's start, and we're concerned, in this, discovery clearly has a lot more red than privilege escalation, although there's not that privilege escalation. But you can start to have those conversations and figure out, okay, we need to start somewhere. Let's start with tools that generally do these types of things. Oh, so we thought about a heck of a lot of stuff as we went through this. Don't make our same mistakes. So some of these we've already talked about. Should protective tools map through data sources? One of these things that we still wrestle with a little bit. Detective tools obviously need to map through data sources. You're detecting against certain types of data, so it clearly maps. If it's a protective tool, however, the fair assessment is you probably can use data sources in a kludgy way as a shortcut. right? So if you need to get this assessment done to start the ball rolling on something, you can probably get away with it. If you're already fairly high on that maturity curve and you have executives that are going to drill into every detail, however, you might want to map protective tools directly to techniques. It's going to be a lot more work, 230 some mappings for every tool as opposed to 50 some. But you're going to get more accurate information.
Yeah. Right. What variables are meaningful indicators of effectiveness? Right. We went through a bunch of things here too, right? We ended up settling on the ones that we already showed you on that kind of that blue area, right? So in terms of like updates and like availability and percentage of deployment across the network, as well as right how well is your team members, how well are your team members actually with like specific tools, right? Are you guys really good on Palo Alto, but maybe mediocre with Carbon Black? Maybe we need more training. What about talent constraints? Do you have enough people, right? Because one of the things that is just, across the board happens in every industry is, hey, boss, I want some budget for this new tool. Oh, I forgot we need people to run this tool. So, but yeah, and if you decide that this is something that you kind of want to like go in and build on your own, right? This is our framework. We kind of like made appropriate, what we thought were often made decisions that made sense to us, but I mean, they don't make sense to you, right? Is a tool only as effective as its weakest variable?
Yeah, so the mechanics behind this start to get interesting, right? So if you're doing an effectiveness assessment and you care about, do we have enough staff? Right, I'm going to rate that 1 to 5 on Carbon Black. And are the staff trained enough? I'm going to rate that 1 to 5 on Carbon Black. And do we do updates enough? And do we do this and that? All right, so now I have 8 variables across the row for Carbon Black. And there's some 1s and some 3s and some 5s. Well, what's the aggregate score for that tool? Is it an average? Is it the lowest of all of it? Is it the highest of all of it? Mechanically, we landed on it's got to be the lowest, right? If you have a camera in your house, but it's not watching all the places you want it to watch, that's great if it's on all the time. That's great if you have history and you can see it on your phone everywhere, but it's not watching everything. So it's going to lower the overall score for that tool. So the way that we treat the scores across every individual tool, we say, look, we're going to take the lowest score for all the variables for a tool. But now when you take a step back and I have multiple tools looking at the same thing, does the same mechanic apply? Because now I have Carbon Black and Palo Alto looking at the same technique, and one of them's a 3, one of them's a 5. Am I still only a 3? Actually, I'm probably a 5. Because if Carbon Black's a 5 on this, then I'm gonna be able to see, because I have multiple things alerting me, and it's gonna take advantage of the best alert, right? So your mileage may vary on those mechanics, and on the assessments that you're performing in the political environment that you work in. You might not want to show 5s across the board for everything, just because that's how the mechanics work out. You say, instead of taking the best score for all the tools, we're going to take the average score, something like that. Because there's potentially something to be said for defense in depth. Or you could say the average score between a 3 and a 5 might bring down your score because there's a lot more noise in this now. And because of our staffing, there's a lower, having multiple tools at different levels, the technique might actually make us less effective. So the mechanics are going to matter, and you're going to have to think about that if you're rolling your own, as far as stuff goes. Should aggregators apply to coverage? We covered that early. And staffing was an interesting one for us.
So one of the things that I think we stumbled initially, right? So if there are 50-some data sources, we initially started asking the questions, okay, how well does your team handle how good is your team around, let's say, process monitoring?
DLL side loading.
Right. Well, the side loading would be an individual technique, right? But the data sources that could detect DLL side loading, how good are you guys at those data sources? And that was the wrong question, right? Because you had to be like, everybody was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Define this data source, define that data source, right? So we realized that they already had mapped the tools to the data sources, So why not just ask about the tools, right? How well are you guys at your Palo Alto firewall? Oh, you're pretty good? Sweet. 4 or whatever. And then we already have that data source mapping to that tool already. So now we can kind of reverse engineer this whole thing and be like, okay, here's the effectiveness from a team training and talent perspective for this tool, and that means that these data sources are pretty good. And then therefore, all of these techniques, we're looking good at, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in terms of using MITRE, it was such an aha for making these assessments go faster, because again, now you're talking to people in a language they understand. You're talking to them about the tools that they work with every day. You don't have to educate them on data sources or techniques or tactics. You guys, the security guys, can know that. Now, if you get some really interested practitioners, by all means, evangelize, right? But for the most part, they're not interested. They got day jobs. They just want to help you get out of their office. So, as far as reporting goes, we touched on some of these already as well. So once you've run detective and protective sort of assessments, when you overlay them, you can see some really cool stuff. Particularly where you might have complete gaps in techniques that aren't being watched or protected against. From a defense in depth perspective, you can see where you have double coverage from a protective and detective perspective, or where you're just detecting or just protecting. And you can really start to see, regardless of whether or not it has been your strategy, you can see where you have ended up. And arranging results by the tactic can actually lead to some cool strategic decisions.
Yeah, so once you kind of have an understanding of the tools and data sources, mapping to kind of like tactics, look, it's great that maybe your controls are really, let's say, good enough across all of the tactics, but I mean, we know, and I'm gonna have to say it, right? The kill chain, whatever you want to call it. There's no booze here. But because of that kind of like concept of the tactical kill chain, right? The attack chain. Why don't you just maybe if you're resource constrained, from a tools and therefore data source perspective, maybe you just get really good at a few of the tactics, right? Because then theoretically, if you can kind of detect and then prevent that chain, that's pretty good. You've prevented likely that entire attack, right? So this gives you insight into where, and it gives you options, right? Maybe we want to be pretty good at all of the things, but maybe we want to be really good at specific tactics. And you can kind of make those decisions.
And because the MITRE attack framework is platform specific with respect to the techniques, you can actually start to, if you pair spending data with that, you can actually start to see in some cases the cost of security solutions by platform, at least the supporting security infrastructure. And that can drive some interesting decisions around, do we want to continue to maintain this platform? We're mostly a Windows shop, but we want to start to do some Linux. What does that mean for us? You can start to say, well, then we're going to have to protect against these things. And you can start to map that out and do some of those what-if scenarios. If we have less platforms, if we have more platforms, that can drive some strategic decisions from an IT perspective. So what else are we doing?
Yeah, so there's this whole mobile framework, part of the attack framework. We haven't even looked at it. Right? So that's one of the things we're going to start looking at the mobile attack framework. Automatically highlight the riskiest techniques based on industry. We kind of gave you a little flavor of that, right? But there's a lot more that I think we can do with that that can provide value. Really kind of more up into leadership as well.
Yeah, automatically detecting redundant tools is one of those things that it sounds really good. It's like four words on a slide and a bullet, but it's mechanically extraordinarily difficult. This might be one that we end up not doing ultimately, but the idea is, right, you have a large organization with a listing of tools, just automatically spitting out options of, well, this tool is fully redundant as long as you keep these 3 tools. tools, or you don't need this as long as you implement these ones better. There's some stuff you can do mechanically to get close to that. Doing it in a fully automated way has some challenges. And another thing we want to do is overlaying, our penetration testing data to illustrate likely attack chains, right? So you can look at any technique sort of in isolation, but the reality is usually they're part of a longer kind of chain. And so once you start to overlay the data about how our pen testers have gotten into networks, you can start to see, well, you might start from a chain, there might be these 3 entry points, but they all consolidate to this node, right? This point. And if you can stop that point, effectively, that's now the technique that you, or the tactic that you care about a little bit more, and you might not care as much about the tactics earlier in the chain. So overlaying that will give us a lot of good information around how best to prevent or detect certain tactics by using other tactics.
Yeah, and we're sitting on a gold mine of information on trusted set. Like 6 or 7 years of like really advanced penetration testing. So it's metadata that's not easily accessible right now because of they're all PDF reports, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to see if I can like hire an intern for the summer and just read through 5 years of penetration testing results and basically get like the top 3 to 5 ways that they have been breached. But now we have things like, okay, it's this size organization, their maturity is X, their revenue is this, and so we can begin really getting some really interesting data for leadership as well. Right? A company in financial with a $2 billion annual revenue, that kind of like companies in that little area right there. Here's all the ways that they were able to, here's their trends. Here's all the ways that they were actually able to be breached and things like that. So that's coming. We'll see how far I get on that. Oh, sorry.
So on your what's next for you, one of the things I'm surprised that I don't see, so it makes me think I missed something. A few slides back, you had talked about the skill level of the people using the tools. And one of the things I see a lot in organizations that have a lot of tools is, just like you said, they got the budget for the tool, but they didn't think they needed training because a salesperson made them think it was like push button and they, carbon black is a perfect example. Oh, we got it, it's too noisy. Well, it's too noisy, you know what you're looking at.
Right.
So one of the things I'm thinking is, do you believe you have come up with a reliable, good, qualitative way, or leaning towards quantitative way of assessing skill level?
Nope.
Okay, so you're saying something's not next, it must be impossible, because that's how I see it.
Right. So in our experience, right, it's kind of like 2 sides of a balance, right? Some organizations are like, yeah, we're a bomb. We're sweet at that. Other organizations, typically larger and more mature, are really hypercritical of themselves. Like, we worked with an organization that looked at our final results and were just like, that's way too high. I can't accept that. That's too good. So, however, to answer your question, it's super, super difficult to get, it's almost like you need social engineering skills to really kind of figure out where what's the middle of that balance.
Or possibly even just documentation, they got some vendor training about the tool. That would be
Yeah, there's a number of different things that you can check, but even if you get vendor training and you're checking that box, I'll argue that vendor training sucks.
And I would say that that question, there's a couple of reasons. That question actually illustrates one of the big reasons why. To us, this is not a replacement for a penetration test. This is an assessment that gives you a lot of good information at the strategic level. But to your point, you might go into an organization that says, yeah, our teams are great, right? You're talking to a manager, oh, you have 10 tools. Yep, we have more than enough people than we need, and they all know everything about the tools that we have, right? For whatever you actually go to a pen test and you test that premise, you might find something different, right? So these kinds of assessments are fantastic for understanding strategically where you are, where you want to be, where you might want to focus resources. But it's not a replacement for a pen test that will actually show you what went wrong.
All right, so yeah, you know, for anybody here who's interested, right? You know, the MITRE ATT&ck, the framework's out there. It's free. You can use it, take a look at it, see if you want to build something like this. I mean, we've built it. If you're interested in that as well, you can just let us know. But you know, again, there are tools out there that, you know, API into the framework. You can pull it down. You know, definitely update it occasionally, as we found out. And I guess, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'll flip the last one. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So,
My associate in the front row.
I know. It's not a
What do you want?
answer question. So, I didn't hear anywhere, do you cover, like, if you have, like, CrowdStrike or something like that, and, like, is it employed throughout the entire organization? Or
That's part of it.
Does that cover it?
That is
part of the
that's part of the calculation. Yeah.
What about, like, configuration? You know, so if you have an IPS and it's not
You're only
looking
using
at
3 out of the 5, you know, let's say functions or something like that.
Right.
We're kind of
Or
asking
you need
those
to buy an
questions
extra
as well.
module.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so if it's about how you're using the tool, right, in terms of collecting data sources, you get that as part of the mappings. But if it's about, you know, how much the tool's implemented in the organization, you get that as part of the effectiveness variables.
Okay.
Yep. Anybody else? Questions? Nope.
That's it then.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.